6 men sit in darkness, ears ringing from anti-aircraft fire that nearly tore their aircraft apart moments ago. The Heinkel. He-111 bomber shudders around them, bleeding fuel from a port engine coolant leak, and they're still 400 kilometers from home base. The pilot grips the control column with white knuckles. Behind him, the flight engineer watches the fuel gauges creep downward with mechanical precision, calculating distances in silence, knowing the math does not favor them today. This is the truth about German bomber crews that the history books don't scream about. It wasn't just the courage to fly into the teeth of enemy defenses, though that alone would break most men. It was the grinding, desperate calculus of endurance. The HE-111 was designed to survive, to stretch the absolute limits of what an airframe could take. But machines have breaking points, and so do the humans inside them. And here's the thing that changes everything. For every crew that made it back, limping home on fumes, 3 more didn't. The aircraft that flew across the channel at 300 meters, that carried bombs to London, Glasgow, and Coventry, was built to absorb punishment. The cockpit, though? That was exposed, transparent, vulnerable as exposed skin. A single machine gun burst from a British Spitfire could erase 5 men in the blink of an eye. Between 1939 and 1945, nearly 2,000 Heinkel He-111 bombers were built. Most never came home. But the men who flew them pushed the boundaries of human endurance past any reasonable limit, again and again, mission after mission, knowing the odds. The Heinkel. He-111 entered service in 1937, and from the very beginning, German designers gave it one critical advantage over every other medium bomber in the Luftwaffe: endurance. At maximum fuel load, cruising at economical power settings, the aircraft could stay aloft for nearly 8 hours straight. In 1940, that meant flying to Liverpool and back. It meant hammering the industrial cities of Britain night after night, and some crews had to return to their bases in daylight, burning off the last of their fuel on the approach, praying that British fighter pilots hadn't spotted them first. The aircraft looked purposeful, even elegant in photographs. The long, smooth nose-housed observation windows and a forward-firing machine gun position where a dedicated bombardier observer kept watch. 2 liquid-cooled engines, reliable Daimler-Benz Phi-12s, powered the airframe at speeds around 470 kilometers per hour. That sounds fast until you realize a Supermarine Spitfire could chase you down at nearly 600. But it was the vulnerability that defined the He-111 experience. The fuselage was fabric, not aluminum. That sounds primitive by modern standards, but it allowed speed and flexibility, and designers hoped it would give the aircraft a chance of surviving flak. What it actually did was make the aircraft a coffin. Anti-aircraft shells, .303 rifle rounds, 20mm cannon fire from British interceptors, all of it tore through the skin like tissue paper. The crew compartment was worse. The pilot and co-pilot sat side by side in a greenhouse canopy made of clear, unarmored plexiglass. During operations over Britain, German bomber crews would lose entire front sections of their aircraft to enemy fire. A Spitfire pilot would see the formation silhouetted against the moonlight, dive through the formation, guns blazing, and that was it. The 2 men in the cockpit would be gone before they could react. Nobody heard them scream. Nobody ever does at 30,000 feet. Endurance, therefore, became a race against time, against luck, against physics. A 6-hour bombing run meant entering the target zone over enemy territory with only a thread of fuel margin remaining. If you were hit, If your engine suffered mechanical failure, if you were forced to divert to a secondary airfield because your primary base was under attack, you were finished. The aircraft would lose altitude over the dark waters of the English Channel or North Sea, and the crew would bail out into cold water, or worse, ditch the aircraft in the black. Between September 1940 and May 1941, the HE-111 was Germany's workhorse for the nighttime bombing campaign against Britain, later called the Blitz. The aircraft flew into loose formations at night, relying on moonlight and the glow of fires from previous raids to navigate and find targets. Navigation was guesswork at best, instruments at worst. Many crews dropped their entire bomb loads on the wrong city, entirely, killing civilians and destroying homes, but missing industrial targets. Still they flew, night after night, pushing the HE-111 past rated endurance limits, fuel tanks running on the edge of empty. The Luftwaffe had no selection process for who would die, no luck factor, only physics, fuel consumption rates, and the speed of a Spitfire's machine guns determined who would return and who would not. The night of November 14th, 1940. 37 111 bombers take off from air bases near Amiens and Saint-Léger-aux-Bois in northern France. The target is Coventry, a medieval cathedral city in the English Midlands, home to clock manufacturers, precision engineering works, and 3 centuries of accumulated history. German intelligence has briefed the crews on moonrise timings and winds aloft. The weather should be clear. The fighters might be asleep. Lieutenant Wilhelm Starr pilots one of those aircraft. He's 26 years old from Stuttgart, son of a banker, and he's already completed 43 successful bombing sorties. His hands are steady as he advances the throttles, and the HE-111's wheels leave the tarmac. Behind him, in the fuselage, are 5 other men. Feldwebel Roth, the bombardier, checking his bomb sight for the 100th time. Obergefreiter Kraft, flight engineer, monitoring the engines. Gefreiter Metzger, radio operator, headset already on, listening to the crackling silence of an uncrowded radio channel, and 2 air gunners, Nagel and Feldman, who will spend the night scanning the darkness for the shapes of enemy fighters. The formation climbs to 19,000 feet over the English Channel. The visibility is good. Too good. Starr can see the coastline of England coming up, and his stomach tightens. This is the moment where the British usually have interceptors waiting. The gunners would already be tracking movement below. Fighter pilots in their stations, engines warming. Nothing happens. The formation crosses the coast unmolested. 20 minutes later, the outline of Coventry appears below. The moon is bright. Roth calls out coordinates to Starr, fingers steady on the bomb sight. Flak begins rising from below. Red and orange tracers climbing at what seems like a leisurely pace until they're screaming past at supersonic speed. Starr holds the aircraft steady, fighting the instinct to turn, to dive, to do anything but maintain altitude as the bombardier does his job. The bombs fall. All 16 of them, 50-kilogram bombs, tumble through the night. Roth's voice is steady. Away! Bombs away! Starr banks left, diving to escape the flak envelope. The HE-111 is faster in descent, and he uses that advantage, descending through 18,000 feet, then 15,000. The bombing run is successful. They saw hits, confirmed fires starting, and now the calculation begins. Can they make it home? The flight back takes 4 hours and 38 minutes by the navigation plan. Current fuel consumption rate, based on climb and cruise power settings, 190 liters per hour. Total remaining fuel, 800 liters in the main tank, 300 in the auxiliary. That gives him approximately 5 hours and 45 minutes of endurance, but the reserve calculation margin is normally 30%, a safety buffer never touched. Tonight, Starr will use every liter of it. Over the English Channel. One of the port engines begins running rough. Kraft checks the instruments, eyes narrowing. The magnetos are cycling slightly, and the fuel pressure to the carburetors is fluctuating. The engine is carburetor icing in the cold, high-altitude air. This is known. Every HE-111 pilot has experienced it. Usually, dropping altitude helps, but they're already down to 8,000 feet, and the flak comes thicker the lower you go. Starr makes the decision without consulting anyone. He advances the other engine to full power and shuts down the port engine completely. Single-engine flight. The aircraft immediately feels different, heavier on the right wing, requiring constant trim adjustments and pressure on the rudder to keep straight. Fuel consumption immediately increases because the remaining engine has to work harder. What should have been a 5-hour, 45-minute endurance now becomes 4 hours and 26 minutes. The math is no longer theoretical, it's existence itself. Feldwebel-Roth checks the navigation plot. Based on current heading and wind estimates are guesses in darkness, you can't see the ground to calculate drift. They might, just possibly, reach the nearest Luftwaffe airfield at Saint-Léger. If the wind is kind. If nothing else fails. If the single remaining engine doesn't overheat and seize before they reach the coast. 3 hours into the return flight, the British night fighters find them. Nobody sees the Spitfire until the muzzle flashes bloom in the darkness. Tracer rounds, burning bright white, come streaking in from the starboard beam, passing through the fuselage with a sound like tearing canvas. Feldman, the starboard air gunner, returns fire immediately, his twin MG-15 machine guns stuttering responses into the darkness. But Spitfires are fast and maneuverable, and they attack from multiple angles. The British pilot, Flight Lieutenant Peter Townsend of 43 Squadron, though Starr will never know this name, has done this before. He circles high, rolls inverted, and comes in again from a new vector. The second attack does the damage. 20mm cannon rounds from the Spitfire hit the starboard engine, the only functioning engine, and Starr feels the aircraft lurch as metal fragments punch through the engine cowling. Fire warning lights flash red on the instrument panel. The engine is failing. Oil pressure drops to 0. Temperature rising beyond limits. Starr has seconds to decide. He can feather the propeller and try to glide the aircraft on momentum alone, with no power except whatever electrical energy remains in the batteries. Or he can try to maintain altitude, fighting for every meter, hoping that the surviving engine holds together long enough to reach the coast. He chooses survival. Feathers the propeller. The He-111 becomes a glider. Kraft is already calculating. No engines means no electrical power, means no radio, no landing lights, no hydraulic systems for gear extension. They will land gear up, belly landing in the darkness, probably in a farm field or forest somewhere in French territory. If they clear the English cliffs, if they maintain altitude long enough to cross the channel. The aircraft descends through 8,000 feet. The glide ratio of an HE-111 is approximately 1 to 12. For every 12 meters of horizontal distance, they lose 1 meter of altitude. The English coast is roughly 120 kilometers away. At the current descent rate, they have approximately 10 kilometers before they're too low to survive a crossing. 8,000 feet becomes 6,000. The coastline has not yet appeared. Starr pushes the aircraft faster, trading altitude for speed, knowing that speed is distance, distance is time. Time might mean the difference between French soil and cold water. The airframe shudders. They're approaching red-line speed on a damaged aircraft, every rivet and strut complaining against the forces. 6,000 feet. The English coast materializes below. Cliffs, villages, roads. They're going to make it across. Feldwebel Roth and the other crew members brace themselves as the aircraft continues its descent toward French territory. Starr has maybe 40 seconds to find a field. 40 seconds to spot a landing area in moonlight. The altimeter winds down. 1,000 feet. 500. The landing lights are out. Batteries dying. So he has only the moon. The field appears. Flat. Open. Fields between Amiens and the aerodrome at Saint-Léger, but Saint-Léger is too far now. The aircraft is at 200 meters above ground, and Starr makes the decision. Belly landing now in the field. The aircraft touches down hard, nose first, plowing furrows in the earth as the fuselage skids forward on bare metal. The wings shudder against the ground. Sparks fly. The radio operator's station collapses forward, but Metzger has already unstrapped himself and thrown, himself clear before impact. The aircraft slides for what feels like an eternity, probably 12 seconds, before the fuselage digs into a depression and the aircraft flips sideways, coming to rest on its starboard wing. Silence. For 5 seconds, absolutely nothing. Then Kraft is shouting orders, and Starr is pushing against his jammed side window, and they're crawling out through the broken windscreen. The port wing, having hit the ground hardest, is crumpled like paper. Both engines are silent, smoking slightly in the night air. The aircraft is utterly destroyed. If they'd been 50 meters lower when Starr glided the engines out, everyone inside would have been killed. All 6 men escape with minor injuries. All 6 survive. What happened to Lieutenant Starr's crew became one of thousands of similar stories that cycle through the Luftwaffe's bomber record books. The aircraft was logged as lost in action, crew safe. Starr and his men were reassigned within 2 weeks. They flew 7 more operational missions before the war situation changed. By 1943, the HE-111 was becoming obsolete, outpaced by newer German bomber designs and facing increasingly fierce Allied interception. But here's where the narrative twists in an unexpected direction. The Heinkel He-111 didn't disappear after the war. Long after Germany surrendered, the Spanish Air Force continued flying. Captured He-111 bombers, renamed them the Casa 2.111, and operated them for another decade. Some versions were built under license in Japan as well. The aircraft that bombed Coventry, that terrorized British cities, that drove thousands of people into concrete shelters night after night, had a strange second life in other nations' air forces. More dramatically, the HE-111's design principles, its emphasis on endurance, on speed over armor, on crew vulnerability as an acceptable cost of range, became a template for how other nations would design their own bombers. The British learned from studying captured aircraft that the He-111's weaknesses were also its strengths. The unarmored fuselage meant lighter weight, which meant greater range. The exposed cockpit meant better visibility for the bombardier and navigator. The twin engines meant that even with one engine damaged, the aircraft could maintain altitude and glide to safety, as Starr's crew discovered. The crews themselves, those who survived, carried different legacies. Some returned to civilian life after 1945, many killed in the final weeks of the war as the Allies advanced into Germany. Others became prisoners, spending years in captivity. A few managed to escape during the chaos of surrender and vanish into the rubble of occupied territory. Some, incredibly, lived well into the 1980s and 1990s, giving interviews about their experiences, their guilt about the targets they bombed, their strange respect for the men who tried to kill them. One of the most remarkable accounts comes from a navigator of the 3rd Squadron, KG-26, the bomber group that harassed the Scottish coast from Norwegian bases. In an interview conducted in the 1980s, he described flying an HE-111 toward British shipping convoys in the North Sea, low level, at 100 meters altitude, where a single flak hit from an escort vessel meant almost certain death. He described the calculus of endurance in brutal terms. You flew to the limit, beyond the limit. When you were at the mathematical edge of survival, the enemy would do something unexpected. They'd scramble fighters you hadn't known were there, or the weather would worsen, or you'd suffer mechanical failure. Most of us expected not to return. It was assumed. The remarkable thing is that despite these odds, despite the vulnerability, despite the desperate calculus of fuel consumption and probability of survival, German bomber crews continued to volunteer. Not because they were fanatics, though some were, because they were professional soldiers caught in a conflict that demanded endurance beyond normal human limits. WWII 111 itself became a symbol of that, not of German technological superiority, but of human desperation. Aircraft could be replaced. Trained crews took months to develop and years to master. By 1943, as the air war turned decisively in the Allies' favor, the Luftwaffe was throwing increasingly inexperienced crews into combat aboard He-111 bombers, knowing that the aircraft themselves were outdated and would be hunted relentlessly. The final operational use of the He-111 came in 1945, in the last desperate missions of the war. By that point, even getting an aircraft to fly at all was an achievement. Fuel was scarce. Ground support was disintegrating. The Luftwaffe was mounting fewer than 10 bombing sorties per month. The endurance that had once been an advantage, the ability to fly 8 hours and return from distant targets, became a liability. 8 hours of flight time meant 8 hours of exposure to increasingly numerous enemy fighters. When Germans surrendered unconditionally on May 7, 1945, the surviving He-111 bombers were a strange sight on the ground. Some still in hangars, others scattered across airfields, many deliberately destroyed by their own crews to prevent Allied capture. The aircraft that had bombed London, Glasgow, Coventry, Belfast, and Bristol had reached the end of their endurance at last. The story of the Heinkel Hi-111 is ultimately a story about human limits, not the limits of engineering, though that matters, not the limits of courage, though countless men demonstrated extraordinary courage while flying that aircraft, but the limits of what human physiology can endure when asked to function at the absolute edge of possibility, hour after hour, night after night, knowing that every decision carries life and death consequences measured in seconds. The crews who flew the HE-111 became specialists in endurance in a way that bomber crews of other nations, who had more armor, more defensive firepower, and generally more reliable navigation systems, never needed to develop. They learned to read fuel gauges the way priests read scripture. They learned to calculate glide ratios and wind drift and descent rates by instinct. They learned to accept vulnerability as the price of range. And many of them died. 2,000 aircraft were built. Roughly 800 were shot, Zachos down or destroyed in combat. Another 400 crash due to mechanical failure, navigation errors, or fuel exhaustion. That's a roughly 60% aircraft loss rate. Bomber command losses were catastrophic. Perhaps 70% of the young men who flew the He-111 operationally did not survive the war. In museums today, the surviving examples of the He-111 are treated with a strange kind of reverence. Historians study them. Engineers marvel at the streamlined fuselage, the elegant design, the efficiency of the systems. But what you notice when you walk around one, when you peer into that transparent cockpit, is the vulnerability. You can see exactly where machine gun rounds would slice through. You can visualize the complete lack of protection for the men who had to sit there, hour after hour, exposed to fire from fighters that were faster, more maneuverable, and better armed. The HE-111 teaches a brutal lesson about warfare. Sometimes the underdog has no choice but to endure, not by choice, but by necessity. The aircraft that survived was the one whose crew pushed past the limits of the fuel tanks, past the limits of the engines, past the limits of their own nerve. Those crews, in the end, embodied the endurance that the aircraft itself represented. They were not heroes in the traditional sense. They were young men, most in their 20s, doing a job they had been trained to do, in a war they had not chosen. Many never saw the damage they caused. Many never understood the full cost of the mission. But all of them, in the darkness over the North Sea, over the Channel, over the cities of England, knew the feeling of flying on the edge, the absolute edge where luck mattered more than skill, where endurance meant survival, and where the aircraft beneath them was nothing more than a fragile shell separating them from the cold night and the guns that wanted them dead. The Heinkel He-111 endured. Its crews endured. Not all of them made it home, but those who did carried forward the knowledge of what the human body and mind can survive when pushed to their absolute limits. Dramatized for storytelling based on historical accounts,